Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And this time you've brought us quite a story,
Yeah,
Red Notice by Bill Browder. You want to understand Browder's journey, particularly his experiences in Russia,
hmm.
and it sounds anything but ordinary.
It really is. It's incredible. This book gives us such a fascinating look at post-Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, we see everything from like the crazy rise of capitalism in the 90s
Oh.
all the way to, the country kind of going downhill with Putin and his authoritarianism.
Yeah, and wow, his family history. I mean, talk about unique. His grandfather was the leader of the American Communist Party.
Yeah.
And then his dad was a top mathematician, but he was ostracized because of that communist lineage. What kind of impact do you think that had on Bill Browder growing up with that kind of background?
It's definitely not your average upbringing, right?
Mm.
It seems like it gave him this sense of being drawn to Russia, but also being a little afraid of it at the same time.
Yeah.
He saw the potential there, all the opportunities, but he always knew there were risks too.
Yeah, for sure. Let's unpack those roots a bit. So his grandfather, Earl Browder, was a labor organizer who moved to the USSR, married a Russian woman,
Wow.
and then his dad, Felix, was born in Moscow. A brilliant mathematician, but ostracized because of his family's communist ties.
Right. So growing up surrounded by that kind of complicated family history,
Hmm.
it's no surprise that Bill developed a bit of a contrarian streak. Like he always had to question everything and look at things from different angles.
Yeah. And his own childhood wasn't exactly normal either. He went to this really tough boarding school, Whiteman, and got bullied a lot.
Yeah, he had it rough there. He actually skipped 8th grade to go to Whiteman,
Oh, wow.
which made him the youngest and the smallest kid there.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine being 13 and just constantly targeted by these older students.
Hmm.
I wonder if that experience shaped how he deals with conflict later in life.
That's an interesting thought. Maybe that's where he learned to stand up for himself and for what he believes in. But anyway, from there, he kind of found refuge in academics, did great at the University of Chicago, and then set his sights on Wall Street.
It definitely shows he was ambitious and wanted to prove himself even from a young age.
But then he gets to Wall Street, and it's not what he thought it would be at all. He was disillusioned by the whole culture. It felt shallow, greedy, just not aligned with his values,
Okay.
which is kind of ironic considering his family's communist background, that he wouldn't like unbridled capitalism. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. He was looking for something more, something that felt meaningful, like he could actually make a difference.
Right.
And then when the Berlin Wall came down and communism collapsed, he turned his attention to Eastern Europe. He sensed there was opportunity amidst all that chaos.
Mm.
Do you think he was actively looking for that kind of opportunity, or was it just lucky timing?
That's a great question. Like, history just opened a door at the perfect moment. He starts working at Boston Consulting Group in Poland and comes face to face with the tough reality of post-communist economies.
Yeah, he saw firsthand what people were going through. It must have been hard for him to see the human cost of the economic changes he was advising on.
Right. And then he gets a job with this guy, Robert Maxwell, a media tycoon.
Oh, yeah.
And in the book, Browder says that Maxwell's staff would cheer every time his helicopter left the building.
Wow, that says a lot about what kind of guy Maxwell was. Everyone knows he was volatile and unpredictable. It was like he was running his company like his own personal kingdom. Talk about a crash course in the dark side of business.
Yeah, but it also gave Browder some really valuable experience in Eastern European investing, something not a lot of people were interested in at the time. Seems like he had a real taste for risk, diving headfirst into the unknown.
Absolutely. And that's what took him to Russia, where he kind of stumbled onto this gold mine, the Russian stock market. He saw that companies were trading for way less than they were actually worth.
Yeah, it's like he had this talent for seeing patterns and understanding the underlying value even when the market was super volatile.
Hmm.
Do you think that's what made him so successful?
Yeah, definitely. He saw the potential while everyone else just saw chaos. But his colleagues at Salomon Brothers, they were so focused on quick profits that they didn't even consider investing in Russia.
Hmm.
They just couldn't see past their own assumptions and totally missed out on the long-term potential. And that's something we see a lot in Browder's story. He's constantly butting heads with people who are just looking to exploit the system instead of investing in it, people who prioritize profit over principles.
Yeah, and that's eventually what leads him to start his own fund, Hermitage, with backing from Edmund Saffer, who is a billionaire.
Right.
It's fascinating to see how that partnership developed, Browder with his vision and drive, and Safra with his money and influence.
Yeah, and they were dealing with an incredibly chaotic market at the time. Browder talks about how he first found success by focusing on preferred shares, which was a strategy hardly anyone else was using.
Interesting.
Shows how innovative he was and how good he was at finding creative solutions.
But then he encountered the dark side of the Russian system and had to face off against these powerful oligarchs who controlled huge parts of the economy.
And remember, these weren't just businessmen. Oligarchs had serious political clout. They were basically operating above the law. And this is where the story starts to get really intense.
So tell us about his first big clash with Vladimir Putin. This oligarch tried to dilute shares in a company where Browder's fund had a big stake. It seems like this is where we see Browder's activist approach to investing start to emerge.
Yeah, he wasn't content with just sitting back and holding stocks. He was ready to fight for his investors and challenge the status quo.
It was a risky move, especially in that environment. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about standing up to a system that was rigged against him.
Exactly. And all this is happening while he's trying to build a life in Moscow. He marries Sabrina, they move there, and then the 1998 financial crisis hits. Talk about a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, no kidding. He could have easily cut his losses and left, but he felt responsible for his investors and was determined to rebuild.
It's interesting, though. It feels like his goals were starting to shift beyond just financial success.
Yeah, you're right. And that's when Elena comes into the picture. She's a Russian economist who becomes Browder's second wife. Their relationship starts with all these intellectual debates, but ultimately deepens his connection to Russia.
It's an interesting dynamic. It's like he was falling in love at the same time as he was realizing he was fighting for something bigger than himself.
Right. And he starts focusing on exposing corruption and pushing for corporate governance reform. He wasn't just an investor anymore. He was becoming an activist.
And that leads us to his investigation into Gazprom, which was this state-controlled energy giant. He found out that the management was stealing huge amounts of money.
Wow.
A scandal so big that, according to the Wall Street Journal, it could have kept all of Europe going for 5 years.
That's insane. It feels like a major turning point because it puts him in direct conflict with Vladimir Putin, who is gaining more and more power at the time.
Absolutely. Challenging the system like that was incredibly dangerous. Browder was exposing the deep corruption that benefited the elite while everyone else suffered. And that's when things got really dangerous for Browder himself.
In 2005, he's suddenly kicked out of Russia. He's stuck in London, cut off from his business.
Yeah, it was a clear message. He had become an enemy of the state, and Putin was tightening his grip on power. The rule of law was disappearing and being replaced by personal vendettas.
So this is just the beginning of Browder's story. He's been forced out, left everything behind, but he's not giving up. It feels like the first act of this much bigger story, setting the stage for a dangerous battle to come.
Yeah, what's striking is how he transformed from this shrewd investor into this unlikely activist. He's been thrust into this fight against a corrupt regime, and his personal story is intertwined with the bigger story of Russia's decline into authoritarianism.
That's a great point. We've only just scratched the surface of this incredible journey. As you continue reading Red Notice, what are your initial impressions of Browder and the challenges he's facing? We'll be back in a moment to dive into the next chapter of his story, so don't go anywhere. We're back, and as we dig deeper into Browder's story, it's clear that getting kicked out of Russia really throws his whole world upside down.
It's such a sudden change. He's in London, separated from his business in Moscow, and he's just trying to figure out what happened. He even tries to contact the U.S. Embassy for help and ends up stuck in this crazy situation.
What happened?
He gets put in an airport detention room full of people chain smoking.
It's like something out of a Kafka novel. The successful investor suddenly becomes this powerless pawn in a web of bureaucracy and secrets.
Yeah, it really shows how power works in Russia. It's completely arbitrary. He's being punished without any explanation, and any wrong move could make things even worse.
So what does he do? He's not the kind of guy to just sit back and take it.
No. Not at all. He starts working the phones immediately, calls his lawyers, contacts at HSBC, even reaches out to the British Foreign Office. He's trying to understand why they're after him and what he can do to fight back. But he's also being warned to stay quiet and avoid the media. Any kind of public outcry could make things worse.
So he's walking a tightrope, trying to navigate this really complex and dangerous situation. And all this while his personal life is falling apart, too.
Yeah, the stress and the distance are really putting a strain on his marriage to Sabrina. They were already having problems, and then this happens. But then in the middle of all this chaos, something happens that gives him a little bit of hope.
What's that?
His lawyer discovers this bureaucratic mistake that could change everything.
Really?
Yeah. It turns out that the Russian authorities were in such a hurry to seize Browder's assets that they went after the wrong companies.
What do you mean?
They meant to target Hermitage's investment companies, but they messed up and seized companies that technically belonged to Browder's clients.
That's almost funny if it wasn't so serious. But this mistake gives Browder an advantage, right?
Exactly. He realizes he can use this to force the authorities to return the stolen assets. But of course, this is Russia, so nothing is ever that easy.
Of course not. So what does he do?
He puts together a team of lawyers. One of them is this fascinating character named Eduard Kiridanov. Browder describes him as a former police investigator who looks like the Marlboro Man.
That's a great visual.
I know, right? It tells you a lot about the kind of people Browder needed to navigate this world. People who were tough, resourceful, and understood how the system worked, both the rules and the loopholes.
So they launch a counterattack, filing complaints, exposing the fraud to the media, leaking information strategically to embarrass the officials involved. It sounds like a high-stakes chess match with Browder going up against impossible odds.
Yeah, and for a while it seems like it's working. They actually managed to get some of the stolen money back. But then things take an even darker turn with the introduction of Sergei Magnitsky. He's a young lawyer who works for Browder's firm.
Magnitsky becomes a key figure in this whole story, right? A symbol of the corruption and brutality that Browder is fighting against. Tell us more about him.
Okay, so Magnitsky's job is to investigate this tax rebate fraud that was done using Browder's stolen companies. And what he uncovers is just mind-blowing. This massive scheme involving corrupt police officers, judges, tax officials, the whole works.
Wow, how much money are we talking about here?
They stole $230 million from the Russian government. Basically, they used these companies to claim fake tax refunds. And Magnitsky, being the meticulous guy he was, gathered all the evidence. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything.
It's hard to believe. He must have thought that once he exposed this, the authorities would have to take action.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But that's where he was wrong. Because instead of going after the criminals, they arrested Magnitsky.
Oh, wow. It's like the whole system is turned upside down.
It's a chilling reminder of how corrupt things were. The powerful people in Russia would do anything to protect themselves, even if it meant crushing innocent lives.
Yeah. So Magnitsky is thrown in prison on these trump-up charges. He's denied medical care and subjected to horrific abuse. Browder describes the conditions: overcrowding, no sanitation, psychological torture, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the human cost of corruption. And Browder, safe in London, feels responsible.
Yeah.
He brought Magnitsky into this fight.
He must feel awful.
He's overwhelmed with guilt and does everything he can to get Magnitsky released. He reaches out to journalists, politicians, human rights groups, anyone who might be able to help. But the Russian authorities don't budge. They ignore international pressure, and Magnitsky's health keeps getting worse.
It's a race against time, and they're losing.
Yeah, but what's amazing is that even in prison, Magnitsky keeps fighting. He files complaints, testifies about the corruption he uncovered, all while he's sick and suffering. He shows incredible courage and integrity.
It's an incredible story of resilience.
It really is. But tragically, after 358 days in detention, Sergei Magnitsky dies in prison. He was only 37 years old.
It's heartbreaking. It feels like a turning point for Browder. His fight isn't just about protecting his investors or himself anymore.
Yeah, it becomes intensely personal. He's driven by this need to get justice for Magnitsky, to expose the truth about his death, and to hold those responsible accountable.
So it becomes this personal crusade that consumes him for years.
It does. And it's also a story that goes way beyond Browder's own experience. It raises questions about corporate responsibility, the limits of the law, and the moral obligation to speak truth to power.
We'll be back in a moment to explore how Browder turns his grief and anger into a global movement for justice. Don't go anywhere.
And we're back. As we enter this final chapter of Browder's story, you really see how Magnitsky's death becomes this pivotal moment.
Yeah, for sure. It's amazing how he takes all this grief and rage and turns it into action. He could have just retreated, grieved in private, but instead he just goes even harder against the Russian regime. He realizes that the legal system is so corrupt that it's not even an option.
So he comes up with this new strategy, sanctions. It seems like a pretty radical idea at the time. Yeah, it was really groundbreaking. He understood that the only way to really hurt these corrupt officials was to go after their money and their freedom. He wanted to make them outcasts, expose them on a global scale.
How did he do that?
Well, he started by painstakingly gathering evidence on everyone who was directly involved in Magnitsky's case. The police officers, the judges, the tax officials who pulled off the fraud and then covered up his death. He dug up their names, bank accounts, travel records, anything he could find to expose them.
That must have been incredibly difficult and dangerous.
It was. But Browder was relentless. He even started posting videos online, like mini documentaries that showed the lavish lifestyles of these officials contrasted with the brutality they inflicted on Magnitsky. It was a really smart way to use the internet to shame them, turn public opinion against them, and pressure Western governments to do something.
So he was basically waging this global PR campaign against them.
Exactly. He traveled all over the world, met with politicians, testified before Congress, gave tons of interviews. He was determined to make sure the world heard Magnitsky's story.
He even asked the U.S. government to use this obscure law proclamation 7750, which lets them ban human rights abusers from entering the country. What was the reaction to that?
At first, he hit a wall. The Obama administration didn't want to jeopardize their efforts to improve relations with Russia. But Browder kept at it, and eventually he found some allies in Congresspeople, like Senator Ben Cardin and Congressman Jim McGovern, who really got behind his cause.
So it sounds like things were starting to gain momentum, and then, as usual, there's another twist.
Yeah, he gets intel from a source that the Russian authorities are planning something new against him and Hermitage. It was a reminder that he was still in danger.
And then there's this really tense part in the book where his lawyer, Edward, has to flee Russia in the middle of the night. He ends up hiding in a safe house to avoid arrest. It reads like a spy thriller.
I know. It really highlights the constant danger Browder was living under. But right as things are escalating, he's contacted by this mysterious figure named Alexander Perpetrators, who claims to have insider information about the tax fraud.
Tell me more about this Perpetrators guy.
He was a Russian banker who had escaped to London. He had a bunch of documents that detailed how the stolen money was laundered through Swiss banks and then used to buy luxury properties in Dubai and Moscow.
That must have been a major breakthrough for Browder.
Yeah, it could have been. But the problem was, they didn't know if they could trust Perpetrators. Was he a real whistleblower, or was he working for the FSB trying to set Browder up? It really shows how paranoid and distrustful the whole situation was.
So while he's trying to figure that out, his efforts to pass the Magnitsky Act are moving forward. But it's slow going.
Oh, yeah. There were hearings, debates, lobbying efforts, all the usual political stuff. But Browder never gave up. He just kept pushing, kept making his case, even when it seemed hopeless.
And then it seems like a few things just happened to fall into place at the right time that gave him the leverage he needed.
Right. Russia was about to join the World Trade Organization, but there was this old Cold War amendment, Jackson-Vanik, that prevented the U.S. from giving them permanent normal trade relations.
So this amendment, a leftover from the Cold War, became a bargaining chip.
Exactly. Browder saw this opportunity and took it. He and his allies argued that if Russia wanted normalized trade relations, they needed to address human rights abuses, starting with justice for Magnitsky.
That's smart. It connected these two totally separate issues.
Yeah, and it worked. All of a sudden, the Magnitsky Act had support from both parties, and it passed through Congress easily. Even the Obama administration couldn't stop it.
So finally, on December 9, 2012, President Obama signed the Magnitsky Act into law. What a victory for Browder.
Oh, yeah. It was a historic moment. It proved that all his hard work had paid off. It sent a clear message that those who commit human rights abuses will be held accountable no matter how powerful they are.
But the story doesn't end there, right? We know Putin wasn't just going to accept this.
Nope. He retaliated by banning American families from adopting Russian children. It was a heartless move, using kids as pawns in his political games.
It seems like such a desperate attempt to punish his enemies.
Yeah.
Did it work?
Actually, it blew up in his face. People in Russia were outraged. There were protests in the streets. Even some of Putin's own people criticized the ban. The Magnitsky Act had touched a nerve, exposed the regime's cruelty like nothing else had.
It really shows how effective Browder's efforts were. But he didn't stop there, did he?
No way. He kept going after other corrupt officials and worked to get Magnitsky Acts passed in other countries. He became this global advocate for justice, a real thorn in the side of authoritarian regimes everywhere.
His story is truly inspiring. He faced these impossible odds and somehow managed to achieve real change.
It's proof that one person can make a difference. Even in the darkest times, there's always hope for justice. Browder's journey and Magnitsky's sacrifice remind us of that.
So as you finish reading Red Notice, think about what this story means to you. How does it change how you think about power justice and the fight against corruption? What can we learn from Browder's unwavering commitment to getting justice? And maybe most importantly, what can we do in our own lives to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard? These are questions worth thinking about, and they're part of the legacy that Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky have left us with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Red Notice. We'll see you next time.